Hi. For this first assignment, relationships, I think there's a tendency for people to kind of overthink it. What the point of the assignment is to get to understand some different design building blocks. So in this case, we're going to be dealing with line, shape, tone, color, texture. And then you can also work with some photographic images, and the photographic images are in there just because as a designer you kind of treat photographs like artists treat these other design elements. You have to think about what photos will work with the rest of your design, so you kind of think in a broad way for those. So when you're dealing with the relationships, you might think in the most basic terms. Thick, thin, big, small, those kinds of things. You don't have to necessarily come up with a crazy deep relationship. It can be very visually easy to compare, and that gets you working with one of the primary principles of design, which is contrast, or sometimes it's referred to in Gestalt principles as the principle of similarity. So obviously things that are dissimilar we tend to see as different. So how can you make things dissimilar enough so that you can see that they're opposite ends of a relationship? So I'm going to just show you a couple of examples of just drawings using these elements just in their most raw form. They're not really, they're not samples of the project, but it gets you thinking about using the elements of design. And hopefully will get you working on this. When you turn this in, you're going to be turning in 5 graphics, and each of the graphics will be a comparison. So maybe they're on 2 separate sides of the graphic. I suppose you could turn in 10 individual graphic files, but that doesn't really drive the point home as much as having an interrelationship between the two items on the page. So instead, think about having 2 items on the same page for each one of the relationships. In the assignment, I might be kind of picky about, at least in the written assignment, it might say something that the relationship, it can't be the same relationship over and over. If you come up with this great theme and you want to work with that theme, I'm not opposed to it, but I'd really like to see you explore 5 different types of relationships that you can get working with these elements of design. That's the intent. Okay, so I'm going to show you just some drawings of design elements for a minute. We'll talk about that. Okay, so for this first set of elements here, we're dealing obviously with line. And line can be all kinds of different things. I've made a couple of different lines here. The top line's just a hand-drawn line without any assistance, and then I made one with a ruler using a pencil, and then I made one with a pen using a ruler. So you can see just among the first 3, I get quite a different mechanical difference on the page. And then I made the fourth one here is with the same pen, but again, that's just dragging with my hand. It's not using a ruler. And then I used a thicker marker, freehand, and then I used the same marker just with a ruler. And then I took the marker and put it on its tip. Let me show you this marker here. Kind of interesting. This is just a Faber-Castell. It's a brush type of marker. So as I draw with it, you'll see I can get a thick point in there, and I apologize, I'm drawing with my left hand, and I can get a thin point with the same marker. So anyway, the point being that even a line, when you say draw a line, lines can have all kinds of different qualities about them. And then I take that even further down here. You notice that I'm drawing a straight line again, but this one's kind of broken up. Is this now one line, or is it numerous lines? There's a Gestalt principle called continuation, where your eye will travel from one item on to the next. And that's kind of what we're seeing here. Our eye is putting this together as one kind of direction line, even though it's broken apart. And then you can see here we obviously can get curvy lines, and we can get curvy and straight lines together in one thing. At some point this starts to become a shape too, right? So where does it cease being a line and become a shape instead? I think that's a good question to explore. And then of course we have kind of a loop-de-loop broken up line again down at the bottom. So those are just some different examples of what you can do with lines, and these are all horizontal lines. If I move it around this way, it takes on a whole different character now that they're moving vertically. Or even more, if I turn them and have them moving diagonally, that has yet different quality to it. There's a tendency, again, these are non-representational forms. They're not supposed to be anything except for lines. But when we look at horizontal lines like this, we tend to think of the horizon. When you look at lines straight up like this, they tend to take on individual qualities about them. They become kind of individual elements. Speed can be represented by diagonals. You'll tend to see you know, a movement or at least dynamic lines can be represented with diagonals. Sorry, dynamic is hard for me to say today. So anyway, there's some lines to deal with. So that's the first one of the illustrations. You're doing a relationship between lines. The next relationship has to do with shapes, and you know, we've been drawing this stuff forever, right? So what I did is I just drew out a couple of different shapes. The first little polygon here is with a with a ruler, and I just scraped it out, and you can see actually the lines extend beyond the edges of the shape. So now it's confusing. It's not quite sure that's line or shape that we're dealing with. So it's a little more ambiguous. It's also mechanical in the way that it's represented, just different than if we were to draw it by hand. So for instance, here we have the rectangle drawn by hand, and it has a different quality. And then here's a rectangle drawn by hand, but now we're using we don't have any of those edges creeping out beyond, like right there. Obviously there's different kinds of shapes. I just drew out rectangles, triangles, circles. There's plenty of different ones to look at, and you can achieve good contrast by playing with those together. And then, you know, we start to get into tints and shades here, depending on how we color it. If the background is colored black and the circle is left there, then obviously we have a white circle, but we have something more where we're dealing with negative space. Negative space is the space around an object. Sometimes you'll notice negative space more with when the object is inverted. And then I also just wanted to kind of show off the different qualities you get depending on the type of thing that makes the shape. Notice that we have a different style or a different softness of lead for this top row of shapes. And then I used a pen and ink to cross-hatch in this second row, and then I used, you know, a darker carbon for this row, and then finally I used ink to fill this in. Now we're kind of dealing with texture, aren't we? What makes these different is the texture involved building them up, but also we're dealing with the tint or the shade. Tint would be the lighter shades, and shade would be the darker range or tone. I should be using the correct terminology. So tones and shades are the darker ones, tints are the lighter ones. I'm going to leave color out of this right now because color's, you know, pretty complex, and I think that there's plenty of examples you can have about color, but I wanted to go on and just look at texture. One thing that I did when I was in school that I had an art teacher recommend it was just to go around and take pictures of different types of texture. And I think when you do that, you become much more aware. So, you know, here's just kind of a standard oak desk. If we compare that to the ACC newsprint schedule, I mean, that has a different softness about it. It obviously it has a different way that it interacts with the light. Notice that the polished desk has kind of this glossy highlight where newsprint has none. If I bring in ruler here, we get much more of a highlight. Obviously, we're getting a metallic highlight in these cases. If I bring in my sandwich baggie that I carry my pencils in, then we get all kinds of interesting texture that's occurring because of that surface. So what texture allows you to do is look at surface, and surface I think is underused in design. Remember, you can scan this stuff in or take pictures of it. You can come up with all kinds of interesting juxtapositions of relationships just by using different types of surfaces. I guess I'm trying to come up with a better term than that. Even this cheesy ACC notebook has kind of the fake suede happening here, and then it's got this kind of goofy, plasticky looking edge. All those textures help tell the story. If I come over and look at, here's a part of my computer. The aluminum deals with light differently than even other metal, right? So here's the ruler here, and then we've got the aluminum right next to it. It might even both be aluminum, but the way that they've been surfaced, it's different and it reacts to light differently. So when you're working with these projects, when you're working on this project, think about how you can get opposites to occur. What is the opposite of shiny? What is the opposite of big? What is the opposite of a surface quality? And you could show that off. So I guess I just wanted to finish with a wrap up on this, in that thinking about those relationships with these different design elements, you can really start to exploit how those things work together, and that's the principle of design. I mean, those are principles of design that you're using. The elements, line, shape, tone, color, texture, those are all building blocks, and then how you get them to interact with each other is the glue or the principle that makes it work. So in this case, again, we're really dealing with contrast being a big principle. Opposite sides of a continuum. Now, if you want to get really risky with this, try to see if you can represent things that are hard to show off. Like, how could you show different emotional states? Could you do that with just line? Could you scratch out one and have one line represent happiness and another line represent sadness? But do it in a non-representational way where you don't draw a face that's smiling and a face that's crying. That's too easy, right? So how could you, using the different types of instruments that we've got, how could you create that feel? So that's an extra challenge for you. I mean, you could stick with the big, small, that kind of stuff, but that gets a little dull. Think about taking it to the next step. How can you challenge yourself to get these design elements to express more subtle or I don't know. You don't observe them in the world. You're not representing them, but the quality of the line creates the quality of the emotion. Or you could do things like hot and cold. Like I mentioned in there, what's cold in Minnesota is probably different than cold in Florida. Well, don't draw snowflakes. How could you do that with line forms? How could you do wet and dry with texture? Now, obviously, you can get somewhat representational there. I could see where people would take an image of something that was, wet, like maybe mud versus cracked land. Now, that's pretty representational. Could you do it with line in a non-representational way? I don't know. So anyway, that's what the assignment's about. I'm sorry to rattle on here, but I hope I've kind of cleared that up a little bit more. And I encourage you. You could do this by hand, or you can do it on the computer. The thing I like about doing it by hand is it opens up a variety of things for you. The computer, there's a tendency for getting kind of the same mechanical look and feel. Sometimes that's a little hard to get the contrasts as wide as they could be. here's an idea. Maybe you use the computer to print out one side, and then on the printed page you draw by hand on the other, and then you naturally develop some contrast. So anyway, there's the assignment. Let me know if you have questions, and otherwise I'm looking forward to at least seeing some planning for it and seeing the project. Thank you.